I used to work maintenance at a school in the valley, but when the heat waves got worse and I lost my job during downsizing, I moved into my cousin's old property on the edge of the hills west of town. He hadn't lived there for years, and the house was half falling apart when I arrived. Still, it was free, and I didn't have much else going on. I thought I'd fix it up while looking for other work. That was the plan, anyway. What happened instead ruined my life. The land stretched pretty far behind the house. Dry grass, rusted fence posts, and the remnants of an old garden that had long since withered. Past that was a cluster of trees that looked almost out of place in the area, thicker, greener, surviving better than the land around them. Behind the trees was a high fence made of rotting wood planks, tall enough that I didn't notice it the first time I walked the backyard. I found the pool a few weeks after moving in. I was cutting down some overgrown shrubs along the back of the property when I saw the edge of the fence through a gap. Curiosity pulled me toward it. The wood had gone soft from years of exposure. It barely took a kick to push a panel loose. On the other side was a concrete patio, cracked and dry, with a deep in-ground pool right in the middle. At first glance, I thought it had been drained and just left to collect rainwater, but when I got closer, I saw the water was full, completely full, right to the edge. There were dead leaves floating on the surface, and the tiles were stained with time, but the water itself was clear. Not a speck of algae. No bugs either. Just quiet, still water, untouched by time. I stepped around it, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. It hadn't rained in over a month, and the drought warnings were all over the news. Nearby reservoirs were dropping by the day. But this pool was full, completely full, as if someone had poured it yesterday. I went back every day that week to look at it. I checked the hose, the pump system, anything that might keep it filled. But the pipes had long since rusted. The filter was dry and caked with dust. There was no sign that it had been maintained in years. And yet, every single day, the water stayed the same. Not an inch lost. I didn't tell anyone. Maybe I should have, but I figured it wasn't hurting anyone, and it felt like my own little secret. Besides, the heat was getting unbearable. I didn't have air conditioning, and the house soaked up heat like a furnace. One afternoon, after sweating through another miserable day, I grabbed a towel and walked out to the pool. I checked the water first. Still no smell, no green tint, nothing floating that hadn't already been there a week before. I dipped my fingers in. It was cold, colder than I expected, refreshingly cold, like it had been chilled. I stripped down and climbed in. The shock of it hit me at once, but after a moment, it was like the best swim of my life. The heat faded from my body. My skin prickled with relief. I dunked my head, floated on my back, and let the silence of the place wash over me. No cars, no people, no noise. Just me in that cold, perfect water. After that, I swam every day. I didn't think much of it when I started feeling sore. At first, it was just my knees, nothing major. I told myself I was probably just out of shape or maybe pulling something while doing housework. But then it spread. My fingers started to ache in the morning. My elbows stiffened up. I noticed I was more tired during the day, slower to move around. I figured it was just getting older or maybe the heat. I wasn't eating great either. But then the hair started coming out. At first, it was just a few strands in the shower. Then it was clumps. I'd wake up with strands stuck to the pillow. My beard came out patchy, like it had been burned off in places. My scalp itched constantly. When I looked in the mirror, I barely recognized myself. My skin had gone pale, and my eyes looked dull, as if I hadn't slept in weeks. Still, I didn't stop swimming. I don't know why. Maybe it was denial. Maybe it was some part of me that didn't want to let go of the only good part of my day. But every time I swam, for those brief moments, I felt better. The pain faded. The fog in my head cleared a little. It was only later, hours later, that everything would return worse than before. By week 3, I was struggling to get out of bed in the morning. My joints creaked with every movement. My fingernails had turned soft and yellowish, and a rash had started crawling on my forearms. I tried to stay away from the pool then. I told myself I needed a break, but the heat was still there, pressing on me day and night. My house felt like it was baking from the inside out. And that pool, the idea of it, kept creeping back into my mind. One night, I swam under the stars. The moon lit the surface in silver, and the cold wrapped around me like a blanket. I stayed in for almost an hour, barely moving, just floating. When I climbed out, I felt more alive than I had in weeks. My body tingled. The aches were gone. I thought maybe I'd turned a corner. But the next morning, I woke up dizzy. I stumbled to the bathroom and looked at myself in the mirror. My lips were cracked. My gums had darkened. And under my skin, I could see faint blue lines, veins or something like them, darker than they should have been, like ink. I panicked. I decided I had to find out what was going on. I started by checking the property records. The pool didn't show up on any of the maps. The land wasn't zoned for a second residence, let alone a private pool. I searched the archives at the city office, but the last update to the property was filed in 1984. No mention of any renovations or additions since then. I talked to the few neighbors that still lived nearby, people in their 70s or 80s. Most of them barely remember the house, let alone the pool behind it. One woman said she thought there used to be a family that ran a construction business out of the garage. Another said he remembered hearing trucks late at night, back in the 80s, but assumed it was just someone hauling dirt. That was when I started digging, literally. Behind the pool, under some loose paving stones, I found a series of capped pipes. They didn't connect to the house's water supply or the old sprinkler system. The metal was dark and oily, and when I cracked one open, a foul chemical smell spilled out, stinging my nose and burning my throat. It wasn't water. It looked like water, but it wasn't. I gathered samples in jars and started calling around. Most labs wouldn't take them without a referral. Finally, I drove 2 hours north to a friend who worked at an agricultural testing center. I lied and said I found a strange pond on my property and wanted to make sure it wasn't toxic. The results came back a week later. The fluid wasn't water. It was some kind of industrial coolant, old, synthetic, and extremely toxic. It contained heavy metals, corrosive compounds, and several banned chemicals, including one that had been outlawed in 1989 for causing neurological damage and cancer in lab animals. The coolant was used in power plants and manufacturing systems. It wasn't just dangerous, it was illegal to dump. I started tracing the companies that had operated in the area during the 1980s. One name kept coming up, Huxley Dynamics, a chemical plant that had since been dismantled after a series of fines and environmental violations. They had settled with the state, quietly, but the records were there. They had been fined for illegal dumping on at least 3 occasions. When I looked at the maps, the timelines lined up. Around 1985, just after the company had lost its dumping permits, a new storage pond was listed in their internal documents. It was never registered with the county. No coordinates were filed. The only mention was a vague reference to off-site containment on the west end of the valley, right where I lived, right where that pool was. It wasn't a pool at all. It was a dump site, a chemical pit covered in tiles and filled to the brim with synthetic coolant that never evaporated, never seeped into the ground, never changed. That was why the water never dropped. That was why the pump didn't work. There was no water circulation because the fluid didn't need it. It just sat there, waiting for someone like me to come along and swim in it. I don't know how long the company kept it secret. Maybe they built a fake patio over it as a disguise. Maybe someone on the inside got paid to keep it hidden. When the plant shut down in the early 90s, the site was forgotten, the land passed down, abandoned, and eventually left to me. But the chemicals stayed. I went to a doctor soon after that. I didn't tell them everything. I just said I thought I had been exposed to something. They ran blood tests, scans, and biopsies. The results weren't good. My white blood cell count was dangerously low. My kidneys showed signs of damage. My nervous system was starting to slow down. They said my symptoms resembled long-term industrial toxin exposure, similar to factory workers who used to clean machinery without protection. They gave me medications, referrals, and a warning. Stay away from the source. But it was too late. I moved out of the house within a week. I burned my clothes. I filed reports with the county, the EPA, anyone who would listen. They sent someone out to investigate, and the last I heard, the site had been flagged for remediation. I wasn't allowed back on the property. Legal teams got involved. I was offered a small settlement to keep quiet. I didn't take it. The damage was already done. Now, a year later, I still deal with the effects. My hair never grew back. I have tremors in my hands. Some days I can't remember. I started running early in the mornings around my neighborhood when the gym shut down for renovation. At first, it was just through the main roads, past the grocery store, around the school, then back. But over time, I got bored of the routine. I wanted quiet, space, and something new. That's when I started pushing deeper into the trails behind the industrial park. They weren't well known, but they were surprisingly clean. On some mornings, I'd see deer, rabbits, even a few foxes. The farther I ran, the more isolated it felt. I liked that. It was on one of those longer jogs, mid-May, when I first saw the pool. It was nestled behind a chain-link fence, mostly covered with ivy and dry leaves. The fence had a bent corner where someone, or something, had forced their way in. Beyond it was a clearing, and in the center was this rectangular pool. No signs, no chairs, nothing else around. Just a pool full of water, surrounded by dead grass and cracked cement. At first, I assumed it was an old facility or some forgotten property. But what caught my attention immediately was the surface of the water. It was still, too still, like glass, not a ripple. And I remember stopping mid-run, breathing heavy, leaning on the fence and just staring. It didn't look right. Eventually, curiosity pulled me in. I stepped through the bent corner of the fence and walked up to the edge. The water was dark, but not dirty. Not green or brown like stagnant pools tend to get. It had a blue tint, but also a strange shine, almost like oil but subtler. I knelt down and reached out to touch it. The surface didn't break the way water usually does. Instead, my fingers met something with slight give, like pressing down on thick jelly or a stretch balloon. I remember pulling my hand back quickly. The sensation was odd. Not cold, not warm, just wrong. But I didn't panic. I told myself it was probably just a buildup of some chemical film. Maybe something left over from whatever the pool was used for. But even then, something inside me registered that it wasn't normal. Still, I came back. The next morning, I skipped my usual route and jogged straight to the pool. I didn't touch the water this time. I just walked around it slowly, noticing how undisturbed everything was. No footprints, no signs of animals, no litter. The water level was perfect, right up to the lip of the tile edge. Not evaporated at all, despite the warm weather and lack of shade. I checked the weather report that night. It had been dry for nearly 2 weeks, and temperatures had hovered near 30 degrees Celsius most days. There was no reason for an outdoor pool to retain that much water. It should have dropped several inches at least, but it didn't. It stayed full. I didn't mention the pool to anyone. Part of me wanted it to stay mine. It felt like a secret, a place that didn't exist on any map. Every morning, I'd jog out there and sit by it. I'd watch the water and try to understand it. On the 7th day, I brought swimming trunks. I know how stupid that sounds now. I knew it was weird, but I told myself that whatever was going on was probably harmless. Maybe it was a rain-fed retention basin. Maybe some hidden underground spring kept it topped off. I rationalized it all. Besides, I was careful. I only went in waist deep at first. The moment I stepped in, I felt the resistance. Not from the depth or cold, but from the water itself. It wasn't like swimming in a pool or a lake. It fought back. Not hard, not violent, but enough that I noticed. It was like moving through syrup, though it didn't stick to me or leave residue. I tried to submerge myself, but it took extra force to push my body down. Even then, it felt like the water didn't want me under. After maybe 10 minutes, I got out. My skin tingled, especially around my joints. I assumed it was from the unusual resistance, maybe the workout my muscles weren't used to. But the sensation didn't go away. By afternoon, my knees ached. My elbows, too. It felt like my whole skeletal system had been compressed, then stretched. I took painkillers and chalked it up to overexertion. The next day, I went back in. This time, I swam a full lap. Slowly, cautiously, I pushed against the tension in the water, trying to find a rhythm. But it never got easier. The water pushed back with the same pressure, almost like it wanted to keep me floating on the surface. Later that evening, I noticed something new. My vision was foggy, not blurry, exactly, but like I couldn't concentrate on anything properly. I felt drained, disoriented. I drank water, lay down, closed my eyes. My thoughts came slower than usual. My appetite disappeared. I stopped going to the pool for 3 days. During that time, I checked my vitals with a smartwatch I use for fitness tracking. My heart rate was slightly elevated even when resting. My blood pressure had gone from perfectly normal to borderline high. I didn't feel sick, just off. Like my body had been recalibrated and I didn't get the memo. On the 4th morning, I returned. I don't know why. Maybe part of me hoped I was imagining things. Maybe I thought I could prove to myself that it was just water and my mind was exaggerating. I swam again, longer this time. I forced myself to do laps for nearly half an hour. When I got out, I couldn't stand straight. I had to sit at the edge for a while until the dizziness faded. That night, I coughed up blood. It wasn't a lot, just streaks in the sink when I brushed my teeth. I convinced myself it was dry air or something I ate. But deep down I knew. Over the next week, everything got worse. My skin felt thinner. My joints swelled. My breathing became harder, like my lungs didn't expand fully. I had to sleep sitting up to avoid the feeling of suffocation. My mind slowed down. I struggled to focus. I forgot what I was saying mid-sentence. I stopped answering calls. I stopped working. Finally, I went to the hospital. They ran a battery of tests. Blood work, scans, x-rays. I was admitted overnight for observation because of unusual respiratory behavior. By morning, my right lung collapsed. They reinflated it with a chest tube. I remember lying there with wires and tubes sticking out of me, barely able to keep my eyes open. The doctors looked confused. They said my lung tissue showed signs of stress and breakdown inconsistent with my age or history. I had no smoking record, no trauma, no obvious disease. Just sudden onset failure. I stayed there 5 days. By the end of the week, I was stable, but they had no answers. One of the doctors asked about chemical exposure. I denied it. At that point, I still hadn't told anyone about the pool. I don't know why. Shame? Fear? It felt like confessing to something unclean. Once home, I decided to collect a sample. If the water had done this, I needed to know what it was. I took a glass jar, walked back to the pool just before sunset, and dipped it in. The surface felt the same, rubbery, resistant, but the water entered the jar after a few seconds. I sealed it tight and brought it home. I contacted a small independent lab that specialized in material analysis. I pretended it was part of an urban runoff study I was conducting for a college project. They didn't ask many questions. 3 days later, they emailed me the preliminary findings. The water sample was contaminated with high concentrations of long-chain synthetic polymers. Industrial grade, the kind used in lubricant gels, military-grade anti-friction coatings, and experimental biomedical applications. It wasn't normal runoff. These were complex chains, unfiltered, suspended in high density. The lab's report suggested they were gel-forming agents, and that the sample might have originated from a chemical waste dumping site or research facility. I read the email 3 times. I Googled everything I could about the specific polymers mentioned. What I found scared me more than anything. When these polymers enter the body, especially through mucous membranes or open pores, they can lodge into soft tissue, especially around joints and organs. They don't always flush out. Some get absorbed slowly, others just stay there. Over time, they cause cellular disruption, inflammation, and sometimes fibrosis. In rare cases, they can trigger autoimmune-like responses. Lungs are particularly vulnerable. My lungs, my blood pressure, my collapsing body, it all made sense. I tried to trace where the pool came from. I dug through satellite images on historical map archives. I found a clue. In the 1980s, the area was owned by a subsidiary of a chemical manufacturer. They had a small testing facility there, decommissioned after an internal fire in 1987. Local news archives mentioned an environmental lawsuit filed and later dropped under sealed settlement. I found one document from the county property office listing the site as restricted utility reserve. No cleanup notice, no warnings, nothing. The pool hadn't been built for recreation. It was probably a containment test site, a place where they experimented with water-soluble polymers in a controlled setting until something went wrong and they sealed it off. Then forgot it, or pretended to. I went to the hospital again, this time armed with the report. The toxicologist was shocked. She referred me to a specialist in environmental exposure. More tests followed. Biopsies. When I first bought the house, I thought I'd found a hidden gem. It was an old 1970s single-story place tucked away on the edge of a forgotten neighborhood just outside of town. The price was good, almost too good, but the listing said it needed some cosmetic updates. I figured I could fix it up myself over time. What really sold me, though, was the backyard, a wide, sunlit space surrounded by trees, with an old but surprisingly well-kept in-ground pool right in the center. The pool was rectangular, deep at one end, with faded blue tiles and cracked concrete along the edges. There were metal railings at the deep end, slightly rusted, and a diving board that creaked a little when I tested it. The water inside was clear, oddly clear, considering the house had been unoccupied for almost a year. I assumed the real estate agent had hired someone to clean it for showings. What I didn't notice at the time, or didn't think about, was that the pool had no visible drain. No esquema basket, no filtration system, no humming bump sounds. I didn't really know much about pools. I just assumed maybe it was hidden or underground or some old-fashioned design I wasn't familiar with. It didn't seem important. The water looked fine. I moved in that July, right in the middle of a brutal heat wave. My furniture came in late, so for the first few days I was living out of boxes, sleeping on a cot, drinking lukewarm water from the tap. That pool saved me from losing my mind. Every afternoon I'd strip down and dive in, floating on my back in the quiet, the sun blazing overhead. The neighborhood was silent. No cars, no barking dogs, just cicadas and the occasional rustle of wind in the trees. I swam every day. At first it felt like a small luxury, my own private oasis. The water was cool and perfectly clean, with no chlorine smell. No bugs floating on the surface. No leaves at the bottom. It didn't even seem to evaporate much despite the heat. I check it every morning, expecting to see some drop in the level, but it never changed. Not even a centimeter. I told myself there must be an underground source feeding it, some spring or pipe. I even joked to myself once that maybe it was magic water. But I let that thought go, because I didn't really believe in anything like that. Things always have explanations. About 3 weeks in, I started feeling run down. I chalked it up to moving stress and the heat. I wasn't eating great, just sandwiches and snacks, and I hadn't slept more than 5 hours a night since I arrived. One morning, I woke up and noticed a metallic taste in my mouth, kind of like sucking on a coin. I brushed my teeth twice, rinsed chewed gum, but it lingered. The next day, I noticed one of my fingernails had a weird ridge across it, like a dent. I thought I'd bumped it or maybe jammed it when moving boxes. Then another nail started to flake. I trimmed it short and forgot about it. A few days later, 2 more started separating slightly from the nail beds. That freaked me out a bit. I checked online, and the articles mostly pointed to vitamin deficiency or fungal infections. I ordered some multivitamins and figured it would clear up, but it didn't. A week after that, I woke up with a sharp pain behind my eyes and a splitting headache that didn't go away after coffee or painkillers. That same day, I bit into an apple and one of my molars cracked. Just cracked down the middle like a dry twig. There was no pain at first, just a sudden, horrible crunch and the feel of something hard rolling in my mouth. The dentist I visited the next morning took one look and asked how long it had been since I'd seen a doctor. I lied and said not long. He patched the tooth, told me I might need a root canal later, and gave me antibiotics. I was starting to worry. The tiredness, the strange nail problems, the tooth, all of it seemed random, but together it painted a picture I didn't like. I tried to be logical. Maybe it was stress. Maybe there was something wrong with the water I was drinking. That evening, on a hunch, I filled a plastic jug with water from the kitchen tap and left it on the counter. I let it sit overnight. In the morning, I checked the jug. The water looked fine. I sniffed it, no odor. Tasted it. It seemed okay. Still, something pushed at me. Something in my gut said it wasn't the tap water. It was something else. That's when my eyes drifted to the pool. I hadn't gone in for 3 days at that point. I'd been too exhausted, but the water still looked perfect, clear and still. Not a single leaf floating on it, even though the trees were full and shedding like crazy in the heat. I leaned down and stared into it. My reflection looked pale, slightly gaunt. I realized I'd lost weight, maybe 10 pounds or more. I hadn't noticed it happening. I dipped my hand in the water and scooped up a handful, letting it trickle back through my fingers. It was cool, almost too cool for the air temperature. That didn't make sense either. I decided to send a sample of it for testing. I found a local lab that did basic water quality checks and dropped off a bottle the next morning. The receptionist told me it would take a few days. I tried to get on with my life, but my symptoms were getting worse. By the fourth day after the test, I'd lost another tooth. This one came out while I was eating cereal. Just slid out like it didn't belong anymore. My nails were brittle and peeling, and the skin on my fingers had started to develop tiny blisters. My joints ached, especially in the mornings. I was sleeping almost 10 hours a night now, but I still woke up exhausted. When the lab called, the voice on the other end was tense. They told me not to drink the water or expose my skin to it until further testing was complete. I said I hadn't drunk it, just swam in it. There was a pause. Then they told me the initial results showed high levels of heavy metals, specifically arsenic, mercury, and something else they couldn't identify yet, possibly lead. They said the levels were high enough to be considered toxic after repeated exposure, even through the skin. I hung up and sat down at the kitchen table, staring at my hands. The tips of my fingers were faintly gray. My gums looked pale in the mirror. I started Googling arsenic poisoning and mercury poisoning. The symptoms matched: fatigue, nail loss, tooth decay, brain fog, even mood swings, which explained the bursts of frustration I've been having lately. But how the hell was that getting into the pool? I spent the rest of that day in research mode. I went online and looked up every article I could find on local groundwater issues, old landfill sites, industrial waste reports. That's when I found an archived environmental bulletin for 1991 that mentioned a waste dumping site located less than a mile from my neighborhood. It had been a private landfill used by several companies from the 1950s through the early 1980s, mostly chemical manufacturing plants that had later gone out of business. The site had been closed and capped, but groundwater contamination was suspected for years afterward. The name of the neighborhood I lived in came up briefly in the report as downstream and at risk, but no follow-up studies had ever been published. I realized then that the pool might not be connected to the municipal system at all. It could be fed directly from a spring or shallow well tapping into that contaminated groundwater. The worst part was that the pool had no filter, no pump, no way to flush or drain the water. It was a sealed system, and I'd been swimming in it every day for weeks. I called a local contractor to take a look. He showed up the next morning and spent an hour walking around the backyard, checking the edges of the pool, tapping on the tiles, measuring things. Finally, he looked at me and said something that stuck with me for a long time. "This ain't a normal pool," he said. "This is some custom job. Might even be built right into the bedrock. No drain, no skimmer, no return lines. If water's coming in, it's coming from underneath." He shook his head. "I'd be real careful with something like this. No telling what kind of crap it's leaching from underground." That night, I went to the hospital and told them everything. They ran blood tests. The results came back 2 days later. My blood arsenic levels were 3 times the maximum safe limit. Mercury was also present in measurable amounts. They admitted me for detox and treatment. I spent a week in a sterile white bed with N4 in my arm and nurses checking my vitals every few hours. The doctors told me I was lucky. Continued exposure would have led to nerve damage, possibly organ failure. I'd already lost a few teeth, and some of the damage to my nails and skin might be permanent. But I caught it in time to prevent the worst. When I got out, I contacted a lawyer. There was no record of the pool being inspected when the house was listed. No documentation on its construction. The real estate agent had assumed it was standard and hadn't checked. I filed a complaint with the environmental department, and a local investigator was sent out. A week later, they confirmed that the pool sat directly above a shallow underground spring. And that spring, in turn, was connected to the water table that ran under the old landfill site. There wasn't much legal recourse. The dumping had been done decades ago, and the companies responsible were long gone. The best the agency could do was declare the pool unsafe and recommend sealing it off. I paid a demolition crew to come in and fill it with cement. Watching them break through the tiles and pour in truckload after truckload of wet concrete felt like closing a chapter one never wanted to revisit. I stayed in the house for a few more months, but it didn't feel like home anymore. Every time I got the idea to practice alone behind the old high school after my third lifeguard class. It was early summer, and the indoor training pool was only available on weekends. I didn't want to wait around. I had just turned 19, had a lot to prove, and wanted to pass the certification test before July. That meant putting in hours, even if it had to be by myself. The pool I found was technically locked, but not really. It sat behind Ashwood High School, which had been shut down nearly a decade ago. Some funding issue or asbestos problem. I didn't really care at the time. The building was still standing, windows mostly intact, and the chain link gate behind it was bent near the latch. You could pull it hard enough, and it would click open. The pool itself wasn't covered or drained, just forgotten. I found it by chance when I was running laps around the school track. I used to go there after my shift at the sandwich place downtown. The track was worn but empty, and that was enough for me. One evening in late May, I ran past the old gym and noticed a gap in the fence. Just curious, I pushed through and walked around the back. That's when I saw it. The pool wasn't huge, maybe 6 lanes across, deep on one side, shallow on the other, with white tiles that were turning green in some spots. But the water was clear. Not perfect, but way better than I expected. I figured it was just rainwater, maybe kept clean by birds or insects or whatever nature does when no one touches something for years. I don't know what I thought, honestly. All I saw was a pool with no one around and no rules. It became a habit. I'd show up just before sunset, hop the fence, do my laps, run through rescue drills in the shallow end, float face down to practice victim identification techniques, stuff we were being taught at the Y. The place was quiet. No lifeguards, no noise, just me in the water. The first couple times I swam there, everything seemed fine. My skin felt a little dry afterward, but I figured that was normal. Chlorine dries you out. Even though I didn't think the pool was treated, maybe it still had some chemicals left over from years ago. I told myself that made sense. Then I started noticing other things. Around the 5th time I swam there, my eyes burned after I came up from a long dive. Not just regular burn like you get at public pools when you forget goggles. This was deep, like something had seeped behind the lens of my eye and was clawing at it. I had to sit on the side of the pool with my head in my hands for 10 minutes before I could see straight again. I rinsed my face with water from the outdoor hose behind the gym. The nozzle was broken, but I managed to get a thin stream going. The water helped, but my eyes stayed bloodshot the rest of the night. That same week, my skin started to itch after swimming. Not right away. It crept in slowly. First, there was a little tightness around my elbows and knees, then red patches along my chest. I chalked it up to dry skin or sweat from running. I started bringing lotion, thinking maybe I had some kind of chlorine sensitivity. I didn't want to stop swimming. I was getting better at my laps, faster underwater, stronger kicks. The pool gave me something I didn't want to give up. One day, maybe 2 weeks after I started using it, I noticed the ladder on the deep end was corroded, rusted all the way down, almost fused into the tiles. The rest of the pool wasn't like that. The walls felt smooth, the water looked okay. But that ladder had taken some kind of beating. One of the steps even had a rough white film on it. When I touched it, it crumbled like chalk between my fingers. I still didn't stop. I started wearing goggles, hoping they'd fix the eye burn. They didn't. The seal around my eyes kept the water out for a minute, maybe 2, but somehow the burn always came. I'd feel a sting, then a sharp pull behind my eyeballs, like something was drawing moisture out of me. My fingernails started to feel soft around then too. They bent when I tried to open a soda can. Not just once, multiple days in a row. One night, after swimming, I ran my hand through my hair and felt a small patch near the back come loose. Just a few strands. I try not to panic. I blamed stress. I blamed everything except the water. I told myself I was imagining it. Maybe it was the heat, maybe dehydration. I didn't think to stop. Then came a night I got dizzy in the pool. I was practicing a timed brick retrieval. Drop a 10-pound rubber brick in the deep end, dive, grab, surface, repeat. It's a common drill in lifeguard training. I had done it a dozen times before. That night, after grabbing the brick and pushing up, my chest clenched. My breath stuck in my throat. My vision tunneled. For a second, I wasn't sure I'd make it back up. When I did, I threw the brick onto the deck and climbed out on shaky arms. My hands were red, not like regular red. They looked scorched, like I'd rubbed them on concrete. My skin was puffy and raw in places. The backs of my knuckles peeled slightly when I flexed them. I went home that night without showering. I didn't feel like standing. My muscles were sore in a strange way, deep soreness, almost chemical. I laid in bed with a wet towel over my eyes, hoping the pain would stop by morning. It didn't. The next day, my eyelids were stuck shut, not from crust or anything, just tightness. My skin had dried and sealed slightly at the corners. I had to ease them open with warm water. When I looked in the mirror, I saw patches of skin along my cheeks and forehead that looked bleached, lighter than the rest, almost flaky. That was the first time I really thought, that maybe something was wrong with the pool. I stopped going for 3 days. I tried to heal. I drank lots of water, used aloe, stayed indoors. But my skin kept itching, even though I hadn't been in the water. Then on day 4, my right hand swelled. The skin between my fingers peeled in strips. It looked like a sunburn, but deeper. I went to urgent care. The doctor looked at my arms and face and asked if I'd been near any industrial chemicals. I lied and said no, just a regular pool. He prescribed a topical steroid cream and told me to avoid the sun. He didn't ask about the water. I should have told him everything. I should have brought someone there, taken a sample, tested it. But I didn't. I didn't want to get in trouble for trespassing. I didn't want them to drain the only place I had to practice. I kept telling myself I could stop anytime, that it wasn't that bad, that I just needed to give it a break and then I'd be fine. So I went back. It was stupid. I know that now, but I wanted to feel strong again. I wanted that sense of control, of focus. I missed the weightlessness. I thought if I wore a wet suit, if I stayed in less time, it would protect me. The last time I went, I brought goggles, gloves, and a long-sleeve rash guard. It wasn't a full wetsuit, but I thought it would help. I planned to just do a short swim, 15 minutes in and out. The air that night was still. No wind, no birds. I noticed a slight sharpness in the air near the pool, like the smell of bleach, but thinner, more metallic. I dipped a test strip in the water, one I'd gotten from the pool supply aisle at the hardware store. The strip turned deep purple almost instantly. I didn't know what that meant. I didn't bother reading the chart. I dove in anyway. The water was colder than usual. Not refreshing, cold in a chemical way. It bit at the exposed parts of my skin, especially my face. I did a few laps, ignoring the tightness in my chest. By the time I reached the deep end, my lips were numb. My nose burned. I surfaced, gasping, and climbed out using the side rather than the ladder. My gloves were melting. The material on the fingertips was gummy and stuck to the railing. My arms were red again, blotchy, like I'd been slapped over and over. I barely made it home. My vision blurred on the ride. I stumbled into the bathroom and threw up twice. My tongue felt thick. I couldn't taste anything. That night, I woke up to the smell of metal. It was coming from my own skin. My chest stung with every breath. I tried to drink water, but it came back up in less than a minute. My mom found me the next morning, curled on the bathroom floor, delirious with fever. She called an ambulance. The ER doctor took one look at my skin and ordered toxicology tests. My arms were blistered. My neck had raw patches. My lips were cracked and white at the corners. Blood tests showed chemical burns and elevated chlorine levels in my system. I was treated for chlorine gas exposure and second-degree chemical burns on over 15% of my body. The doctors said if I'd stayed in 5 minutes longer, my lungs might have started hemorrhaging. I spent 3 days in the hospital. They wrapped my arms in cooling gels, kept me on fluids, monitored my breathing. One of the specialists asked where I'd been exposed. I finally told them everything. The old school, the pool, the smell. They sent a team out to investigate. Turns out the filtration system under the school had been improperly sealed when the building shut down. The system, rusted and inactive, still had stores of concentrated chlorine, solid and gas. Over the years, leaks had released pockets of chlorine gas into the surrounding ground and water. Without circulation, the pool absorbed it slowly, saturating the water. No dilution, no ventilation, just layers of trapped, chemical-heavy water sitting in the sun. It wasn't rainwater that kept it full. It was groundwater seeping up from a broken line beneath the gym. That same line had passed through the decaying filtration system, pulling trace amounts of chlorine with it. Not enough to smell, not enough to discolor. It was the stillness that pulled me in at first. I'd driven past that flooded quarry a few times over the years, a wide, oval basin of water trapped deep between limestone walls. The signs around it were old, their paint peeling, warning of unsafe conditions and unstable depths. But there was no fence, no cameras, and no one around. It wasn't listed on any diving guidebooks I had, but that only made it more tempting. It was a man-made lake, maybe a quarter-mile wide and ringed with sloping rock. I'd never seen anyone else there, no swimmers or hikers, no beer cans or bonfire rings. The water never moved, not even a ripple. On a windless day, it looked like a giant pane of glass fitted into the rock. I had picked up diving a year before, mostly self-taught. A few lessons at the local pool, secondhand gear bought online, and a few shallow lake dives to get a feel for it. I wasn't certified, not officially, but I knew how to manage my equipment, how to watch my air, and how not to panic. I wasn't trying to do anything dangerous. I just liked the quiet of it, the separation from everything above. I parked a little ways off the gravel path and carried my gear in suit, fins, tank mask. I brought a spare flashlight, a depth gauge, and a waterproof watch. The air was warm that day, a little sticky with late summer humidity, but the water stayed cold just a few feet under. That contrast always gave me a shiver when I first submerged. Cold seemed to rise from the quarry bottom and hug my ribs through the suit. The first few minutes under a normal. Visibility was poor, like I expected, but there was a greenish glow that helped in the shallower layers. Silt clouded easily if I kicked too hard, so I moved slow, holding my breath at times, not from fear but from the strange silence that made breathing feel louder than it should. My flashlight helped, though the beams scattered pretty fast through the particulates. There wasn't much to see near the surface. No fish, no weeds, not even garbage. Just smooth rock walls and a few scattered slabs of concrete. I assumed some construction debris had been tossed in after the quarry closed. At 15 feet down, the light started to fade. At 20, it was gone. I flicked on the flashlight and kept going. Something felt wrong at 30 feet. Not dangerous, just heavier. The water itself felt thicker somehow. I could still move fine, and my regulator worked properly, but the light didn't cut as far anymore. There was a smell too. Impossible underwater, but it was there like battery acid and wet iron, faint but persistent. I figured it was runoff or algae rot, something chemical leaching in from the walls. I reached 40 feet, checked my gauge, and hovered there. I didn't want to go too deep the first time, but the curiosity kicked in again. I was only using half a tank. I figured another 10 feet wouldn't hurt. At 50 feet, the water turned completely black. The flashlight lit only what I pointed directly at. No ambient glow, just tight cones of vision. I swept it around slowly, seeing nothing but more sloped rock and pale silt. No movement, no wreckage, not even plant life. That absence was what unsettled me more than anything. And then I saw something metallic. A few feet below me, partly buried in the silt, was a rusted metal casing, maybe 2 feet long, dented and flaking. I angled down toward it and brushed away some of the muck. There were more, dozens of them, some stacked, some scattered, all roughly the same size. I didn't know what they were at the time. Old equipment, maybe, or waste barrels. I kicked softly to rise up, not wanting to disturb more of the silt, but as I turned, I saw that the entire slope beneath me was covered. Hundreds, maybe thousands of the things. They weren't new. They looked ancient, corroded almost beyond recognition, but they had that unmistakable industrial design. Boxy, reinforced edges, thick seams. I didn't want to go deeper. My chest had started to ache, and my thoughts felt a little slow. I looked at my watch and realized I'd been under longer than I'd thought. Almost 30 minutes. I hadn't used as much air as I expected, but something about the pressure felt wrong. It wasn't just physical. My head buzzed like I'd stood up too fast. On the way up, I started to feel worse. Not a full panic, but my limbs felt heavy, like swimming through syrup. I lost track of how far I'd gone. My flashlight beam blurred. I checked my depth gauge, but the numbers looked smudged. I rose faster than I should have, knowing it was risky, but not caring in that moment. I just wanted out. Breaking the surface was like waking up from a thick, dreamless sleep. The sunlight hurt my eyes, and my skin felt tight. I dragged myself onto the rocks and sat for a long time without moving, just letting the cold air dry on my suit. My mouth tasted metallic. I assumed it was from the regulator, maybe old rubber or mold in the mouthpiece. But the taste stayed all day. Driving home was difficult. My head pulsed in slow waves, and my limbs wouldn't stop trembling. It wasn't exhaustion. This was different, deeper. Inside, I drank water, ate some toast, and lay down. That's when the nausea hit. Not violent, just constant. A seasick kind of queasiness that lingered under every breath. I tried to sleep it off, but the buzzing in my head made rest impossible. The next morning, things got worse. I stood in the shower and realized I couldn't remember what day it was. My phone said Tuesday, but I was sure it was Saturday. I kept staring at the calendar app, confused why the numbers didn't line up. My legs were sore not from strain, but in a deep, vibrating way. My joints ached like I'd been beaten, and my gums bled a little when I brushed my teeth. I thought maybe I had decompression sickness, but I hadn't gone deep enough, and I'd only stayed down for half an hour. Still, I went to an urgent care clinic just to be sure. They ran basic labs and told me I had elevated lead levels in my blood. That didn't make sense at first. I hadn't worked with paint or pipes or anything industrial. They asked about hobbies. I told them I dove in lakes. They asked which ones. That's when I started digging. I went back online, searched for quarry lakes in the area, found old documents, scanned forums, anything I could find. The one I dove in didn't have an official name anymore. Locals called it Stillwater. Just Stillwater. A post on an old diving forum caught my eye. Someone had asked years ago if it was safe. No one replied, but one user had left a short warning. Old battery dump. Don't touch the bottom. Battery dump. I searched deeper and found a 1993 environmental survey of closed industrial sites in the county. The quarry had been owned by a battery manufacturer in the 70s. They'd gone bankrupt in '82. Before that, they had dumped tons of scrap material, including battery casings, into the pit before it filled with rainwater and runoff. Thousands of pounds of lead plates, acid cores, broken shells, all of it submerged and forgotten. The report listed it as an unremediated site. That meant no cleanup, no treatment. Just a warning and a few old signs left behind. The worst part wasn't that I'd touched them. It was that I'd stirred the silt. I'd kicked up decades of settled lead dust and suspended particles. I'd swum through it, breathed through the regulator as it stuck to my skin, clung to my suit, got in my mouth. The symptoms progressed. Over the next week, my memory fractured in strange ways. I'd forget my address, then remember it hours later. I'd write emails and read them the next day with no memory of sending them. My hand shook constantly. Food lost its taste. My hair started to fall out in clumps. Not fast, not dramatic, just a few strands each morning, then more. I went back to the clinic. More tests, higher lead levels. They started chelation therapy, pills to bind the metal and flush it out. But it doesn't leave quickly. It sits in bones and organs. It lingers. The damage, they said, might not reverse. I quit diving, sold the gear. I threw out the wetsuit, even though I'd washed it a dozen times. I couldn't look at it without getting sick. My apartment filled with sticky notes, reminders, schedules, medication times, just to keep me moving through the day without forgetting where I was going. I never told anyone exactly where the lake was. I thought about reporting it again, but what would that change? The company was long gone. The signs were there. People knew. They just didn't care anymore. Time buried the danger. Now, months later, I still taste metal when I wake up. Some days I feel okay. Others, I drift through fog. I see things move in the corners of my eyes that aren't there. Not ghosts, just slips, errors in my own head. I'm not dying. Not quickly. But something inside me is shutting down one small piece at a time. Stillwater looked calm. Empty. Safe. But stillness can hide anything. Especially the kind that waits, patient and silent, just beneath the surface. I didn't think much of it when I first heard about a few students getting sick on the 4th floor. Upset stomachs, vomiting, diarrhea. Nothing unusual for a college dorm, where people ate from questionable street stalls and kept their rooms less than clean. But when it started happening to more people, always from the same floor, always with the same symptoms, I began to wonder if something else was going on. I lived on the second floor of the hostel in one of the older dormitories of our university. It was a plain 5-story concrete building, nothing fancy. Narrow hallways, buzzing fluorescent lights, shared bathrooms with rusting pipes and low water pressure, and paper-thin walls. My room was small but functional, single bed, desk, cupboard, and a cracked window that never closed properly. Nothing out of the ordinary. I had lived there for over a year without problems. But it was the 4th floor that changed everything. At first, it was just Arun, a quiet guy who kept to himself. Then it was 3 others the next day. A week later, nearly a dozen students on that floor were down with the same symptoms: persistent nausea, vomiting, cramping, diarrhea, low-grade fever. Some had to be hospitalized for dehydration. People joked it was a bad batch of chicken curry from the canteen or a virus going around. But nobody else in the building was sick. Not on the 3rd floor, not the 5th, and not us on the lower floors. Just the 4th. I started to notice patterns. One of my friends, Rishi, often hung out with a guy from the 4th floor and spent the night there a couple of times. Sure enough, 3 days later, he was sick too. He threw up all over our shared bathroom and had to be taken to the health center. He recovered after a few days, but that's when I started digging. It wasn't any kind of virus. If it were, it would have spread randomly. But this was restricted to a single floor. That made no sense unless something specific to that floor was the source. I started asking around quietly, keeping track of who had symptoms and who didn't. I even made a list on my phone, organizing it by room numbers. The pattern was undeniable. It was something on the 4th floor. I started spending more time up there, just wandering the hallways, pretending to be looking for someone or hanging out in the common area. The bathrooms smelled faintly sour, even though they were cleaned regularly. The water from the taps looked normal at first, but once I filled a glass and let it sit, a faint yellowish tint started to appear. I sniffed it. It didn't smell like chlorine or anything sharp, just a dull, metallic odor. The 4th floor's water was off somehow. I ran a little test. I filled 2 identical bottles, one from my floor and one from the 4th. I labeled them discreetly and put them in my closet for a few days. When I opened them again, the difference was obvious. The second bottle had a brownish residue along the sides and an oily film on the surface. It smelled like old metal, like rusty tools after rain. The bottle from my floor was fine. I didn't know what I was looking at exactly, but I knew it wasn't right. I started reading about water contamination, specifically how rust and bacteria can build up inside and used or damaged pipelines. That's when something clicked in my head. A few months back, there had been a big water supply shutdown for maintenance. They had dug up the area behind our hostel, blocked off the supply for a weekend, and done some pipe replacement work. I remembered the notices, the buckets of stored water we were told to keep in our rooms, and the general chaos. After it was over, everything seemed to go back to normal. But maybe it hadn't. Maybe something had gone wrong in that process. I visited the campus maintenance office under the excuse of needing old utility records for a class project. The man at the front desk was bored and didn't ask too many questions. He handed over a stack of blueprints, some from the time of construction and some updated more recently. I sat there and compared the layouts of the water systems between the floors. Something stood out. There was an old underground water line marked in blue ink on the original plans. It ran underneath the building and had been marked decommissioned in a later revision. But in the most recent update, that line had been reconnected, specifically to the 4th floor's water line, as part of the rerouting done during the recent maintenance work. I stared at it for a long time. They had reconnected an old pipe that hadn't been used in years. If what I'd read was right, such pipes can collect rust, sludge, and microbial buildup if left in use for long periods. And if that pipe had cracks or leaks underground, it could easily be a source of contamination, especially if it was near a sewage line or another compromised water path. The staff had probably ignored the original status of the line and simply reconnected it to complete the reroute faster. I went back to my room with the blueprints folded tightly in my bag. I couldn't stop thinking about the risk. Bacteria like E. coli, Giardia, or even rust-loving microbes could easily make people sick if consumed. The symptoms matched what people on the fourth floor were experiencing. Still, I wasn't sure. I needed more evidence. I borrowed a water testing kit from a friend in the environmental science department. I told him I was curious about the tap water, nothing more. It came with strips, small containers, and a guide on how to read results for things like iron, pH, nitrates, chlorine, and bacteria. I tested water from my floor and the fourth again. My results showed elevated iron and bacterial presence in the fourth floor sample. It was subtle, but enough to be worrying. The iron levels were higher than the safe limit, and the bacterial markers showed signs of coliforms. The water was not safe to drink. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the students still living up there, still using that water to brush their teeth, to drink, to wash their faces. Even if they were boiling it or using filters, the contamination might be enough to cause illness. And the administration hadn't said a word. I decided to act. First, I compiled everything I had, photos of the dirty water, test results, the blueprint copies, the list of 6 students with dates and room numbers, and notes on the maintenance work timeline. I printed it all out and wrote a short summary explaining my findings. It took most of the night. The next morning, I went straight to the warden's office. He wasn't there. I waited. Then I tried the health center. I found a nurse who had treated many of the sick students. She looked tired but listened. I handed her the folder and explained everything, trying to stay calm and factual. Later that day, she called me. She had passed a report to the campus sanitation team and the engineering office. Within 2 days, they were inspecting the fourth floor pipes. I stayed out of the way, but I saw them with their tools and scanners, opening ceiling panels, accessing maintenance hatches. Then I saw the expressions on their faces. They looked worried. They found a problem. The old underground pipe had been reconnected during the rerouting work after the maintenance shut down. It had not been properly flushed or cleaned. Worse, it had a small crack near one of the joints underground. Water from surrounding soil, possibly contaminated by nearby sewage drainage, had been seeping into it. Rust, sediment, and bacteria had built up inside, and that water had been going straight to the fourth floor. It wasn't sabotage or a deliberate mistake. It was negligence. The team had used an outdated blueprint during the repair and didn't check the original decommissioning notes. They had connected a dangerous line into a live water system without verifying its integrity. The administration acted fast after that. The fourth floor water line was shut off immediately. Temporary water tanks were brought in. They flushed and disinfected all the pipes. Some sections had to be replaced entirely. The cracked underground line was sealed off properly this time. The engineering staff involved received formal reprimands. Students who had fallen sick were offered compensation for medical expenses and an apology. But most importantly, the sickness stopped. Within a week of the repairs, no new cases were reported. Those still recovering improved quickly. The bad water was gone. No announcement was made to the entire hostel. It was all handled quietly, internally. But I knew what had happened. I saw the mistake, the chain of oversight, and how easily it could have continued unnoticed. If I hadn't been curious, if I hadn't asked questions, how long would it have gone on? How many more students would have gotten sick? The whole thing left a bitter taste in my mouth. Not just the water, but the way it was handled. A simple maintenance decision, a wrong line connected, and dozens of students had fallen ill. The institution's internal systems weren't built to catch such things. It took someone on the inside noticing the details. After that, I kept looking at the walls, the ceilings, the pipes differently. I kept wondering what else was hidden behind concrete and metal, what else might be slowly going wrong without anyone knowing. I still lived in that hostel for the rest of the year, but I never drank from the tap again. I boiled everything. I used filters. I filled reports if I saw the slightest issue. It made me paranoid, maybe, but it also made me aware. Water is something we take for granted. You open the tap and assume it's clean. But one hidden pipe, one forgotten section of infrastructure can change everything. I never got sick, but I can have. I first found the pool by mistake. I wasn't looking for anything. I was just walking to clear my head. The university library had been packed that week, midterms around the corner, and my room in the dorms felt tight and full of stale air. So I headed out with no plan, just a jacket and a bottle of water in my bag. I ended up walking farther than I meant to. Past the gym, past the tennis courts, past even the engineering sheds behind the south block. Eventually, I found a wired gate hanging loose from its hinges behind a row of dumpsters. There are no signs, no tape, no markings, just that wide opening like a broken jaw. I slipped through. Behind it was a narrow alley of overgrown weeds and crushed plastic bottles. The kind of place where time stalls and everything looks abandoned, even when it's not. The concrete underfoot was cracked and buckled, and the smell of dust and mold got thicker with each step. That's when I saw it. The building was low and squat, made of pale concrete slabs. One corner was covered in ivy, almost like the plants were trying to pull it back underground. There were no lights, no windows, just a door hanging slightly open. I pushed it with my foot. It groaned, but didn't creak like in movies. The sound was real, dull, mechanical. Inside it was dark, but not pitch black. Light came from the holes in the roof, panels long gone, casting lines and squares on the tiled floor. I stood at the threshold for a long time. The smell of chlorine was faint, but still there, clinging to the air like old perfume. I stepped in. The room was enormous, larger than the university's indoor pool by far. The tiles were cracked, the diving boards bent and rusted, the walls stained in long vertical lines like old tears. But the pool itself was still full. The water looked almost black. Still, not a single ripple. I don't know what made me walk around it. Maybe curiosity. I walked past the rusted lockers, the broken benches, and sat down at the shallow end. That's when I noticed something strange. It was quiet. Not just quiet in the usual sense. Not like a library or a quiet morning. It was something else. I shifted on the bench and heard nothing. My shoes scraped the tile, but I heard nothing. I clapped my hands without thinking, and nothing came back. No echo. It was like the sound stopped existing after I made it. I picked up a loose tile from the floor and tossed it into the deep end. It sank without a splash. The water didn't even move. I should have left right then, but I didn't. The next day, I brought a towel and swim shorts. I don't know what I was thinking. Maybe I wanted a secret place. A pool just for me. Maybe I was drawn to how quiet it was. Like nothing could reach me there. Like I could press mute on the world. I slipped into the water. It was cold, but not freezing. The kind of cold that grabs your ribs, but not your bones. I pushed off the wall and started to swim. I've been swimming since I was 8. I used to compete. I know the rhythm of laps, the way breath flows with motion, the sound of your own body carving through water. But here it was like I was deaf. I couldn't hear my arms enter the water. I couldn't hear my breath. I couldn't even hear the gentle thrashing of kicks behind me. There was only silence. A heavy, pressing silence. After 10 laps, I stopped. I tread water, looking around. Still nothing. No echo. No ambient noise. No dripping. Even my heartbeat felt distant. I got out, dried off, and left. But I kept thinking about it. I went back again the next day, and the next. I started swimming longer, timing myself, trying to beat my old records. The silence became something I craved. It made me feel weightless. Not just in the water, but in my head. No stress, no pressure. Just silence. I started skipping the campus pool. I stopped going to the gym altogether. That hidden pool became my place. I never saw anyone else there. But then the tinnitus started. At first, it was faint, a whine at the edge of hearing, something I could almost ignore. But it didn't go away. I noticed it most at night, a ringing that seemed to grow louder in the dark when everything else was quiet. I thought maybe it was stress. Exams were close. I was tired, so I kept swimming. Soon, I started noticing a sort of pressure in my ears, like when you're on a plane, but it never clears. It got harder to balance when I turned my head quickly. I started hearing crackling and static in my skull. I tried telling myself it was allergies, or that I had water trapped in my ears, but it kept getting worse. The ringing turned into roaring. The pressure became sharp pain. Sometimes after a swim, I couldn't hear anything at all. My ears would feel blocked for hours. I started getting dizzy during lectures. One time, I nearly passed out walking down the stairs outside the chemistry building. That's when I stopped going to the pool. But the damage was already done. I went to the campus clinic. They refer me to ENT. Audiology tests showed something was wrong with my cochlea. The tiny hair cells in my inner ears, ones responsible for translating sound vibrations into electrical signals, were deteriorating. The audiologist asked if I've been exposed to loud noise recently. Concerts? Headphones? Machinery? I told him no. He nodded, but I could tell he didn't believe me. I kept quiet about the pool. I stopped sleeping properly. The ringing was constant now. It felt like someone had installed a high-pitched whine directly into my brain. I couldn't concentrate. I started failing small assignments. I snapped at people for no reason. I kept searching online for answers. All I found were message boards full of people describing the same symptoms: constant tinnitus, ear pressure, hearing loss. But no one mentioned silence. Only noise. I finally told one of my professors. Not everything, just that I found a strange, abandoned pool on campus. I asked if he knew anything about it. He stared at me for a long time before saying he didn't think it existed anymore. Said it had been closed for decades. A failed experiment in architectural acoustics, he thought. He mentioned a group of postgraduate engineers in the 70s who tried to build an Olympic standard pool with optimized soundproofing for training purposes. I asked why it was abandoned. He said something about lawsuits and funding cuts. Then he stopped talking. That night, I couldn't take it anymore. I went back to the pool. It looked the same. The water was still. The room was still silent. I shouted into the void. Nothing came back. I took out my phone and recorded myself clapping, splashing, shouting. The video played back with no sound at all. Not even static. Just pure, flat silence. I emailed that video to the university's acoustic physics department. A week later, 2 men showed up at my door. They weren't professors. They were part of a research group from a private lab that worked with sound wave behavior in enclosed spaces. They asked if I could show them where I found the pool. I hesitated. Then I agreed. We walked there just past dusk. They carried equipment: microphones, frequency meters, parabolic recorders. When we reached the building, they both stopped in the doorway. One of them turned and asked me how many times I'd swum in that pool. I said maybe 10, maybe 15. He winced. They spent 3 hours inside. I waited outside, trying not to pace. When they came out, they both looked pale. One of them handed me a small notepad with scribbled equations. He explained what they found in very technical terms at first, but when I didn't understand, he broke it down. The pool's architecture was flawed, or maybe designed too well. The entire structure created a complex, standing wave pattern, invisible to the eye, but incredibly precise. The walls, the ceiling angles, even the depth of the pool contributed to it. Sound waves would enter, reflect, and cancel each other out. Not all sound, but certain bands. Most of them, actually, anything between 200 hertz and 12,000 hertz. The range humans mostly use was being neutralized in real time. They said it was like stepping into a vacuum. Your ears pick up nothing, but your brain still expects sound. That mismatch creates strain. The body tries harder to hear. The hair cells in your ears start overcompensating. And with repeated exposure, they collapse. The pressure I felt? That was my brain trying to process a lack of expected feedback. The ringing? That was the sound of my ears dying. They said I was lucky. They told me prolonged exposure could lead to full hearing loss. That what I experienced was like staring into the sun for too long. Not immediate damage, but cumulative and irreversible. They were going to seal off the building, maybe demolish it. There were talks of publishing a paper on it. They offered to refer me to specialists. I nodded, but I knew the damage was done. Now, months later, I still hear the ringing. Every hour, every day. It never stops. Sometimes I hear whispers of things that aren't there. Not voices, just shifts in pitch, like my brain is trying to simulate sound it remembers from before. I've started using hearing aids, not to hear more, but to mask the silence with white noise. To give my brain something to hold on to. People think silence is peaceful, that it's rest. But real silence, deep, engineered silence, doesn't rest. It consumes. It takes away the background hum of life that keeps us grounded. The rustle of papers, the wind through trees, the creak of your own muscle. Here, anymore did I. T was the stillness that pulled me in at first. I'd driven past that flooded quarry a few times over the years, a wide, oval basin of water trapped deep between limestone walls. The signs around it were old, their paint peeling, warning of unsafe conditions and unstable depths. But there was no fence, no cameras, and no one around. It wasn't listed on any diving guidebooks I had, but that only made it more tempting. It was a man-made lake, maybe a quarter-mile wide and ringed with sloping rock. I never seen anyone else there, no swimmers or hikers, no beer cans or bonfire rings. The water never moved, not even a ripple. On a windless day, it looked like a giant pane of glass fitted into the rock. I had picked up diving a year before, mostly self-taught. A few lessons at the local pool, secondhand gear bought online, and a few shallow lake dives to get a feel for it. I wasn't certified, not officially, but I knew how to manage my equipment, how to watch my air, and how not to panic. I wasn't trying to do anything dangerous. I just liked the quiet of it, the separation from everything above. I parked a little ways off the gravel path and carried my gear in: suit, fins, tank mask. I brought a spare flashlight, a depth gauge, and a waterproof watch. The air was warm that day, a little sticky with late summer humidity, but the water stayed cold just a few feet under. That contrast always gave me a shiver when I first emerged. Cold seemed to rise from the quarry bottom and hug my ribs through the suit. The first few minutes under were normal. Visibility was poor, like I expected, but there was a greenish glow that helped in the shallower layers. Silt clouded easily if I kicked too hard, so I moved slow, holding my breath at times, not from fear but from the strange silence that made breathing feel louder than it should. My flashlight helped, though the beams scattered pretty fast through the particulates. There wasn't much to see near the surface. No fish, no weeds, not even garbage. Just smooth rock walls and a few scattered slabs of concrete. I assumed some construction debris had been tossed in after the quarry closed. At 15 feet down, the light started to fade. At 20, it was gone. I flicked on the flashlight and kept going. Something felt wrong at 30 feet. Not dangerous, just heavier. The water itself felt thicker somehow. I could still move fine and my regulator worked properly, but the light didn't cut as far anymore. There was a smell, too. Impossible underwater, but it was there like battery acid and wet iron, faint but persistent. I figured it was runoff or algae rot, something chemical leaching in from the walls. I reached 40 feet, checked my gauge, and hovered there. I didn't want to go too deep the first time, but the curiosity kicked in again. I was only using half a tank. I figured another 10 feet wouldn't hurt. At 50 feet, the water turned completely black. The flashlight lit only what I pointed directly at. No ambient glow, just tight cones of vision. I swept it around slowly, seeing nothing but more sloped rock and pale silt. No movement, no wreckage, not even plant life. That absence was what unsettled me more than anything. And then I saw something metallic. A few feet below me, partly buried in the silt, was a rusted metal casing, maybe 2 feet long, dented and flaking. I angled down toward it and brushed away some of the muck. There were more, dozens of them, some stacked, some scattered, all roughly the same size. I didn't know what they were at the time. Old equipment, maybe, or waste barrels. I kicked softly to rise up, not wanting to disturb more of the silt, but as I turned, I saw that the entire slope beneath me was covered. Hundreds, maybe thousands of the things. They weren't new. They looked ancient, corroded almost beyond recognition, but they had that unmistakable industrial design. Boxy, reinforced edges, thick seams. I didn't want to go deeper. My chest had started to ache, and my thoughts felt a little slow. I looked at my watch and realized I'd been under longer than I'd thought. Almost 30 minutes. I hadn't used as much air as I expected, but something about the pressure felt wrong. It wasn't just physical. My head buzzed like I'd stood up too fast. On the way up, I started to feel worse. Not a full panic, but my limbs felt heavy, like swimming through syrup. I lost track of how far I'd gone. My flashlight beam blurred. I checked my depth gauge, but the numbers looked smudged. I rose faster than I should have, knowing it was risky, but not caring in that moment. I just wanted out. Breaking the surface was like waking up from a thick, dreamless sleep. The sunlight hurt my eyes, and my skin felt tight. I dragged myself onto the rocks and sat for a long time without moving, just letting the cold air dry on my suit. My mouth tasted metallic. I assumed it was from the regulator, maybe old rubber or mold in the mouthpiece. But the taste stayed all day. Driving home was difficult. My head pulsed in slow waves and my limbs wouldn't stop trembling. It wasn't exhaustion, this was different. Deeper. Inside. I drank water, ate some toast, and lay down. That's when the nausea hit. Not violent, just constant. A seasick kind of queasiness that lingered under every breath. I tried to sleep it off, but the buzzing in my head made rest impossible. The next morning, things got worse. I stood in the shower and realized I couldn't remember what day it was. My phone said Tuesday, but I was sure it was Saturday. I kept staring at the calendar app, confused why the numbers didn't line up. My legs were sore, not from strain, but in a deep, vibrating way. My joints ached like I'd been beaten, and my gums bled a little when I brushed my teeth. I thought maybe I had decompression sickness, but I hadn't gone deep enough, and I'd only stayed down for half an hour. Still, I went to an urgent care clinic just to be sure. They ran basic labs and told me I had elevated lead levels in my blood. That didn't make sense at first. I hadn't worked with paint or pipes or anything industrial. They asked about hobbies. I told them I dove in lakes. They asked which ones. That's when I started digging. I went back online, searched for quarry lakes in the area, found old documents, scanned forums, anything I could find. The one I dove in didn't have an official name anymore. Locals called it Stillwater. Just Stillwater. A post on an old diving forum caught my eye. Someone had asked years ago if it was safe. No one replied, but one user had left a short warning. Old battery dump. Don't touch the bottom. Battery dump. I searched deeper and found a 1993 environmental survey of closed industrial sites in the county. The quarry had been owned by a battery manufacturer in the 70s. They'd gone bankrupt in '82. Before that, they had dumped tons of scrap material, including battery casings, into the pit before it filled with rainwater and runoff. Thousands of pounds of lead plates, acid cores, broken shells, all of it submerged and forgotten. The report listed it as an unremediated site. That meant no cleanup, no treatment. Just a warning and a few old signs left behind. The worst part wasn't that I'd touched them. It was that I'd stirred the silt. I'd kicked up decades of settled lead dust and suspended particles. I'd swum through it, breathed through the regulator as it stuck to my skin, clung to my suit, got in my mouth. The symptoms progressed. Over the next week, my memory fractured in strange ways. I'd forget my address, then remember it hours later. I'd write emails and read them the next day with no memory of sending them. My hands shook constantly. Food lost its taste. My hair started to fall out in clumps. Not fast, not dramatic, just a few strands each morning, then more. I went back to the clinic. More tests, higher lead levels. They started chelation therapy, pills to bind the metal and flush it out. But it doesn't leave quickly. It sits in bones and organs. It lingers. The damage, they said, might not reverse. I quit diving, sold the gear. I threw out the wetsuit, even though I'd washed it a dozen times. I couldn't look at it without getting sick. My apartment filled with sticky notes, reminders, schedules, medication times, just to keep me moving through the day without forgetting where I was going. I never told anyone exactly where the lake was. I thought about reporting it again, but what would that change? The company was long gone. The signs were there. People knew. They just didn't care anymore. Time buried the danger. Now, months later, I still taste metal when I wake up. Some days I feel okay. Others, I drift through fog. I see things move in the corners of my eyes that aren't there. Not ghosts, just slips, errors in my own head. I'm not dying. Not quickly. But something inside me is shutting down, one small piece at a time. Stillwater looked calm. Empty. Safe. But stillness can hide anything. Especially the kind that waits, patient and silent, just beneath the surface. I took the trip because I needed time off. That was the whole reason. Just time away from the noise, the people, the rush. I've been working long hours back to back, trying to stay on top of deadlines, skipping meals, barely sleeping. When I started waking up confused in my own apartment, forgetting what day it was, I figured I needed a break before something snapped. So I packed my car, loaded my tent, sleeping bag, a portable stove, canned food, and drove north. The national forest I chose wasn't far, maybe 3.5 hours from the city. I'd been there once years ago with friends, but this time I planned to camp alone, away from the main trails. I wanted peace, and I didn't want anyone finding me or asking questions. I parked at the far end of the forest-designated lot and hiked in, choosing an overgrown footpath that looked rarely used. I followed it for nearly 2 hours, not even sure where I was heading. The trees got thicker, the light thinner, and eventually I found a small flat clearing tucked in a pocket of tall spruce trees. It was maybe 20 meters across, damp and mossy, with no signs of trash, tracks, or people. It felt like nobody had been there in years. It was perfect. I pitched my tent, arranged my supplies, and lit a small fire before sunset. That first night was quiet, just the chirping of insects and the soft creaks of wind moving through the trees. I slept better than I had in weeks. It was on the second day that I found the pool. I've been walking further into the woods behind my camp, looking for firewood and trying to get a sense of the terrain. About 10 minutes in, I stepped out of the brush into another clearing, a larger one. The first thing I noticed was the silence. Not even birds, just stillness. Then I saw it. In the center of the clearing was a pool, perfectly round, about 8 meters in diameter. The edges were lined with concrete, pale and smooth, like it had been poured recently. No cracks, no weeds growing through it. The water was so still it looked like glass, reflecting the sky above it like a mirror. I stepped closer. There were no pipes, no ladders, no drains, and the floor sloped evenly from the edges toward the center. The depth was hard to judge, but it looked dark in the middle, deep, maybe. What struck me wasn't just the weird location. It was the geometry. The shape was too perfect. Not a leaf or speck of dirt in the water. Not a single chip in the concrete. The circle was clean, precise, as though someone had cut it into the earth with a laser. I felt strangely calm just looking at it. I crouched by the edge, stared into the water, watched how it held the shape of the sky, like it was absorbing it. It wasn't until I felt a sting on my neck, a mosquito or something, that I snapped out of it and stood up. I went back to camp, but the image stayed in my head all night. That perfect circle in the middle of nowhere. Who built it? Why? There were no signs of construction nearby. No paths, tire tracks, fences. No sign anyone had been there in a long time. By the third day, I went back. I didn't plan to swim, just wanted to look again. But when I got there, the stillness made me feel calm again, like the pool was a kind of safe place. Like stepping into a memory where everything was clean and simple. I took off my shirt, sat at the edge, and let my legs dangle in the water. It was cold, but not unpleasant. I slid in slowly, surprised by how smooth the walls felt. No algae, no sharp bits, just a soft concrete curve. I waded in until the water was up to my chest and swam toward the center. The moment I reached the middle, I felt something odd, a shift in pressure in my ears, like I'd gone underwater or flown too fast. My head throbbed slightly, and I got this faint sense of spinning even though the water was completely still. I swam back quickly, pulled myself out, and sat there for a while with my head in my hands. The pressure passed, but I felt off for the rest of the day. Dizzy, like I'd stood up too fast after lying down for too long. Still, when the evening came, I felt this pull to go back, like a habit forming. I couldn't explain it. I told myself the water was good exercise, that I'd been dehydrated, that the dizziness was from skipping lunch. But the truth is, I just wanted to be back in that perfect shape. Every night I swam. I never stayed more than a few minutes. Just enough to float in the middle, let my arms drift to the sides, feel the circle all around me. It became a kind of ritual. Wake up, make breakfast, gather firewood, write in my notebook, and then when dusk fell, walk back to the pool and swim. On the 7th night, I woke up with blood in my nose. Just a thin line running over my lip, dried in the corner. I didn't think much of it. Maybe the air was too dry, but then the headache started. Dull at first in the back of my skull, then sharper, heavier. I took ibuprofen, drank more water, but nothing helped. One morning I got out of the tent and didn't recognize the area for a second. I stood staring at the trees, unsure which direction was which. It passed after a minute, but I felt shaken. I opened my notebook to look at my entries, but one page was missing, torn out. I had no memory of doing that. The following night, I stayed out of the water. I forced myself to sit at the edge and do nothing. But even then, I felt the spinning again. I touched my face and realized I had another nosebleed. It was on the 9th day that I noticed the humming. It was faint, low, barely audible. A steady sound, like a diesel engine buried deep in the earth. I pressed my ear to the concrete and felt a soft vibration. The water rippled faintly at the center, even though there was no wind. I started to get suspicious. I walked around the clearing, looking for wires, access panels, vents, anything. But there was nothing, just that flawless circle in the ground, surrounded by trees. That night, I didn't sleep. My head pounded. When I closed my eyes, I saw the pool from above like it was still there in my mind, perfectly round, always centered. I couldn't escape the image. The next morning, I packed my gear and hiked back to the car. Back home, the symptoms didn't go away. My vision blurred at times. I forgot appointments. Woke up with aches in my joints, nosebleeds every few days. I didn't tell anyone. I didn't even want to talk about it. But I did start researching. I looked up the area I had camped in, tried to find maps, history, any mention of strange construction. Nothing came up at first, just generic hiking blogs and old forestry data. But then I found a reference in a Cold War-era declassified report, a geometric calibration field installed somewhere in the vicinity of that forest for satellite testing. I dug deeper. Old university papers mentioned a radar calibration station built decades ago. Nothing public, just mentions in passing. It was designed for testing low-frequency electromagnetic alignment tools. Buried arrays, underground beacons, things like that. The technology was phased out in the 90s. The sites were supposed to be decommissioned or dismantled. I reached out to a retired engineer who had worked in remote instrumentation. I emailed him, asking vague questions about circular calibration arrays in forested areas. He replied with a single sentence. If you found one still active, you should get yourself scanned for EM exposure immediately. That made something click. I scheduled a private clinic visit and told them I'd been exposed to high EM fields accidentally. They ran tests, neurological, hematological, even did an EEG. The results weren't clear-cut. I didn't have tumors or massive lesions, but there were abnormalities. Slowed processing speeds, slight delays in visual spatial recall. My white blood cell count was low. They didn't have explanations, only suggestions. Sleep more, eat better, reduce stress. But I knew the cause. Weeks passed. The image of the pool still haunted me, not because of how it looked, but because of how it made me feel. That calm, that stillness, it hadn't been natural. It had been part of the effect. I'd read about very low-frequency electromagnetic fields interfering with cognitive patterns, affecting the brain's sense of balance, causing vertigo, nausea, memory loss, even altered emotional states. I ordered a portable EM reader. It arrived 3 days later. I drove back up to the same trailhead, hiked the same overgrown path, and returned to the clearing. The pool was still there, still perfect, still untouched. I didn't go near it. I turned on the meter and walked the perimeter. Even from 10 meters away, the reader spiked. Low-frequency EM waves, constant, steady, far beyond safe exposure limits. As I stepped closer, the signal peaked. Right over the center, it maxed out, the screen blinking in warning. The hum was louder too, not in volume, but in my skull. A pressure building, like my brain was being pushed from the inside. I left. I didn't swim. I didn't linger. I walked away, and this time I didn't look back. When I got home, I contacted the Forest Service, gave them a vague report about unstable concrete structures in an unregistered clearing. I didn't expect anything. But a month later, I went back online and found a new notice. Access to that section of forest had been restricted due to environmental instability. They gave no details. It's been almost a year now. I was on my 3rd week of hiking alone through a stretch of national forest in a part of the state most people don't even bother to look at on a map. The hills weren't exactly mountains, but they weren't gentle either. The trails disappeared sometimes, fading into dry pine needles and low scrub. And the deeper I went, the less I trusted the satellite maps I'd downloaded. I carried everything I needed: tent, food, water purifier, my small notebook with sketch trail lines, a GPS that kept losing signal but gave me a general sense of direction when it worked. I wasn't a novice. I'd done solo hikes like this before, mostly to reset my head. No phone reception, no emails, no traffic, just my body moving forward each day and my thoughts chasing behind it like a dog on a leash. By the time I found the pool, I hadn't seen another person in 3 days. The forest had turned dry and red by then, scraggly trees leaning in all directions, branches stripped thin by wind. I was following what looked like an old service road, cracked and overgrown, but still traceable through the brush. I hadn't planned on going this far, but my curiosity kept pulling me deeper. I'd noticed faint signs of past use: concrete footings hidden under moss, rusted bolts sticking out of dead stumps, a twisted length of metal cable half buried under the soil. Not recent, but not ancient either. Maybe something had operated out here once. Logging, a mining camp, maybe even military. The map didn't say. I stumbled on the pool in the late afternoon. It was carved directly into the rock, oval-shaped and longer than most backyard swimming pools, maybe 20 meters end to end. The water was almost perfectly still and dark blue, cleaner than I expected in a place like this. There were no trees overhanging it, no floating leaves or algae, nothing visible moving below the surface. The stone around it was pale and dry, smooth in some areas like it had been poured or worn down over time. I thought at first it might be natural, a rock basin formed by erosion, but the edges were too clean, too even. I could see the faint outline of square bolts along one lip of the pool. Metal fasteners rusted, nearly invisible. This wasn't nature. Someone had built it. There were no fences, no signs, no safety rails, no steps, no ladders, no shallow end markings. Just a deep stone bowl filled with silent water, tucked in a forgotten corner of a dead forest. I crouched beside it, dipping my hand into the surface. The water was cold, but not shockingly so. Clear enough to see my hand blur as it sank, but not deep enough to see the bottom. I leaned in further and stared, trying to judge how far it went. The light faded quickly, like the walls inside were sloped, almost funnel-like. I stood up and looked around. Nothing nearby looked like a structure. No changing rooms, no benches, no lights. No one in their right mind would swim here. And yet, it was beautiful in a strange way. Secluded, peaceful. My shirt was soaked with sweat, and my legs were starting to cramp. The day had been hot, and the idea of slipping into cold water, just for a few minutes, felt like relief wrapped in temptation. I hesitated, but only for a moment. I stripped down to my shorts and left my pack under a nearby bush. I walked slowly down one edge, with a rock dip just slightly. There was no obvious entrance, so I sat and slid myself in. The water reached my ribs instantly, cold wrapping around my skin like cling film. It was deeper than I expected, right from the edge. No ledge. My toes couldn't find purchase on anything. I kicked off gently and let myself float, keeping my arms stretched. The water didn't pull me, didn't swirl. It just held me like I was in a tub. I stayed close to the edge, circling slowly. After a while, I let myself drift farther, kicking lazily. That's when I felt the slope. I wasn't more than 5 meters from the edge when my body tilted, as if something under me suddenly dropped. I kicked down to steady myself and felt nothing. No floor, no resistance. Just water under my feet and a sudden sensation of slippage. I tried paddling back toward the rim, but my arms weren't pushing much water. I angled myself up, then sideways, trying to glide closer, but it felt like every movement made it worse. I tilted again, my legs kicking wildly against the cold. The slope wasn't just downward. It curved, like a funnel. I stretched my legs out and tried a scissor kick, pushing backward, but I couldn't get a grip on anything. My arms started to tire quickly. I'd been moving longer than I thought. I tried lunging toward the edge with my full body, but I misjudged and went under. The cold hit my throat. I choked, surfaced, gasped. The edge looked so close, but it wasn't coming any nearer. My limbs started to shake, not from panic, but from exhaustion. There was nothing under me, and the walls I could see were too smooth, too steep to reach. I treaded water, slowing my breath, forcing myself to stop thrashing. The sun was beginning to slide down the horizon. I couldn't let myself stay here too long. I turned slowly, gently kicking toward the direction I came from, trying to keep my arms moving in rhythm, using every trick I'd learned from swimming classes years ago. I angled slightly, aiming not for the closest edge, but the flattest looking section. After what felt like an hour, but was probably 5 minutes, my fingers scraped stone. I clawed up and grabbed hold of the dry lip, pulling myself out in one lunge, scraping my thighs and ribs on the gritty surface. I lay there for a while, wet and shaking, trying to catch my breath. My chest felt tight. My arms burned. My legs cramped. I rolled to my back and stared at the sky until the dizziness passed. That night, I didn't sleep. I set up my tent a few hundred feet away, but my mind kept circling back to the pool. Something about it wasn't right. It wasn't just the slope or the lack of ladders. The way the water held still even when I kicked, the perfect symmetry of it, the cold that didn't seem natural. I kept thinking about the shape of it, that smooth, sloping descent into nothing, like a drain or a trap. The next morning I circled the pool again, this time looking for any markings, any stamps, any names. Nothing. No brand, no government tag, no maintenance plates. Just faint metal bolts, evenly spaced, the kind used to attach safety railings or grates. All gone now. I followed the faint road deeper and found what looked like the remains of a gate. 2 rusted posts with nothing between them, half swallowed by trees. I decided I needed to know more. I marked my GPS, packed my gear, and hiked back out over the next 3 days. When I got to the nearest town, I paid for a motel and spent the next 2 nights researching everything I could. Old topographic maps, historical land use records, decommissioned government facilities. I looked up the coordinates and traced them back through multiple overlays. It took hours, but I found it. A line in an old PDF scan of 1978 Federal Defense Report. The site had a code designation, SRT 57. It had been used for conditioning assessments for aquatic endurance under extreme duress. I didn't understand what that meant at first, but I kept digging. In 1981, the facility was officially shut down after a loss of life incident. The details weren't public, but a university thesis from a military history student mentioned the program by name Resistance Drowning Conditioning. It had been a psychological and physical endurance test used for special forces candidates. They were lowered into that pool in weighted gear and instructed to survive for an undefined period of time. No instructions, no assistance. The slope floor was designed to prevent resting. No handholds, no ladders, no shallow zone. They weren't being taught to swim. They were being tested to drown. One paragraph haunted me. It said, facilities were designed with 0 exit parameters to simulate hopelessness and force adaptive behaviors. The test only ended when the subject either lost consciousness or displayed unconventional survival mechanisms. They were never meant to be survivors, at least not in the traditional sense. I closed the laptop. My skin was clammy. My lungs ached again just thinking about it. I hadn't imagined the slope. I hadn't imagined the feeling of being pulled deeper by my own motion. That place wasn't for swimming. It was for breaking people. I stayed in town one more night, just in case someone was watching the GPS pings. Paranoia, maybe, but I couldn't shake the idea that I'd stumbled into something I wasn't meant to survive. I deleted the coordinates from my device. I erased the route from my notebook, but I couldn't erase the memory of the water closing over my face, the silence of the slope, the way it kept pulling me gently downward no matter how hard I fought. When I finally got home, I started checking pools. At hotels, gyms, resorts. I looked at the angles of their floors, the presence or absence of ladders. I realized how much we rely on little things, handholds, shallow ends, safety railings to feel safe. Remove those, and water becomes something. I was behind on deadlines when I booked the place. I'd spent weeks chasing clients who didn't want to pay, editing wedding albums late into the night, and sending out my portfolio to agencies who didn't care. So when I saw the listing for the estate, I jumped on it. It was advertised as a minimalist retreat for creatives. The pictures were sparse: white walls, huge windows, polished concrete floors, and a pool that looked like a shard of obsidian sunk into the earth. The idea was to spend 2 weeks out there and shoot new content. Portfolio pieces, self-directed editorials, maybe even a few nature shots. The estate was up in the hills, at least an hour's drive from the nearest town. No neighbors, no street noise, no distractions. The price was too good, but I figured it was just off-season or maybe the owner was desperate for renters. When I arrived, it was even more beautiful than in the photos. Stark lines, clean architecture, floor-to-ceiling windows facing the valley. The pool sat at the back of the house, pressed into a slab of stone, perfectly still. It had no visible edges from the main room, just a black rectangle that looked like a void carved out of the landscape. I didn't go in the pool that day. I walked the perimeter, shot some wide-angle photos of the house catching late sunlight, dropped my bags inside, and spent the evening wiping dust off my lenses and pulling files from my memory cards. I slept in the main bedroom with the windows cracked open and the scent of dry grass and eucalyptus floating in. The next day, I shot a few portraits using the time shutter and a tripod. I wore a black linen dress and went barefoot. I was trying to get something with atmosphere, a bit of mystery, and I thought the pool would give the shots a quiet kind of menace. I positioned myself at the edge of the water, just far enough that my reflection would show in the frame. Except it didn't. The pool was perfectly still, but the surface showed nothing. No ripple, no shimmer, no echo of my shape. I stepped closer, staring down. It was like the water wasn't there at all, just a black plane with no depth. I thought maybe it was the angle or the way the light was falling, so I shifted around, bent forward, tried a lower angle. Still nothing. I even waved my hand. No deflection. The camera didn't catch it either. It wasn't until later, while editing the photos, that I noticed something odd. The water looked thicker than it should have. It wasn't glossy. There was no sharp contrast between water and air, no sparkle at the edges. Just this dense, matte blackness. I thought maybe it had some coating, or maybe the bottom was painted a specific way. Black bottom pools were trendy again, supposedly made the water look deeper, more luxurious. The third day was when I decided to get in. It was hot. I'd spent the morning shooting outside and came back sweating. I threw my dress onto the floor and walked straight to the pool in my underwear. I didn't test the water, didn't dip a toe in. I just climbed in. The water felt cooler than I expected, but not cold. It didn't smell like chlorine. It didn't really smell like anything. It clung to me strangely like it had weight. I floated for a while on my back, watching the sky. The surface felt thick against my skin, like it was holding me up. I ran my fingers through the water and noticed they felt slick, almost greasy. I stayed in for maybe 15 minutes, maybe more. When I got out, my skin had a strange sheen. I wiped down with a towel, and it left faint dark streaks. I showered twice. The water coming off me in the shower was slightly tinted like dirty dishwater. I figured maybe there was some algae or the pool chemicals were off. I wasn't worried. I felt relaxed, loose-limbed, floaty. That night, I felt slightly nauseated. I thought it was the heat, maybe dehydration. I drank 2 bottles of water and went to bed early. But the next morning, I woke up with a dull headache behind my eyes. My limbs felt heavy. There was a rawness in my throat like I breathed in smoke. I chalked it up to bad air quality or maybe a seasonal allergy. Still, something in me itched to get back in the water. It became a habit. Each day around noon, I'd go into the pool. 10 or 15 minutes. Sometimes more. I stopped bringing a towel. I liked the way the water felt on my skin afterward, that strange softness, like I'd been coated in something protective. I even started taking underwater shots with a waterproof casing. The photos came out odd, colors warped slightly, and skin tones looked grayish under the surface. I thought maybe I'd do a series on it. Something abstract, eerie. But my symptoms got worse. By the 5th day, my skin itched constantly. Not everywhere, just the backs of my knees, my forearms, the sides of my neck. I developed small red patches, like rashes, that flared up and then faded unpredictably. My eyes burned in the mornings, and I couldn't shake the taste of metal from the back of my tongue. The headaches came in waves, sharp pulses of pain that made it hard to focus. I started sleeping more, 12, 13 hours. I thought maybe I was sick. I took my temperature. It was normal. I didn't have a thermometer, but my skin didn't feel hot. Just dry. And the itchiness worsened after every swim. It wasn't until I was cleaning my camera gear near the pool and accidentally knocked a lens cap into the water that I noticed something else. The cap floated, but not like it would in regular water. It moved sluggishly, like it was suspended in jelly. I leaned over, squinted at the surface. It was hard to see through. No light penetrated. No ripple when I dipped the stick in. And when I pulled it out, it was coated in a dark film, almost imperceptible unless held to the light. I started thinking about oil. Not cooking oil, but something heavier. Industrial. I remembered how slick the water had felt, how it had clung to me. I walked into the kitchen and pulled out a clear glass. I scooped water from the shallow end and held it up. It looked black in the pool, but in the glass, under the kitchen lights, it was clearer. Still, there was a visible film floating on top, a rainbow sheen when tilted, the kind I'd seen on puddles near gas stations. I poured it down the sink and washed my hands 3 times. I didn't get in the pool again after that. Instead, I sat inside with all the windows open and drank water. I scrubbed my skin with soap and an old exfoliating mitt I found in my bag. The itching persisted. I Googled my symptoms, cross-checking rashes with chemical exposure, and the results didn't comfort me. Benzene, toluene, long-term exposure risks, skin absorption, respiratory irritation, central nervous system effects. I read that crude oil exposure through skin can lead to fatigue, dizziness, nausea. Longer exposure increases risks of leukemia, anemia, immune system suppression. My stomach turned. I've been swimming in that water every day for nearly a week, floating in it, letting it soak into my skin. I went back to the pool, this time wearing gloves and a mask I'd packed during a photo shoot. I took another sample using a mason jar from the kitchen. I let it sit. After half an hour, the separation was obvious. A clear fluid at the bottom, and a murky, almost gelatinous layer floating on top. I couldn't be sure, but I suspected it was a thin coating of crude oil, maybe left behind from some industrial runoff, maybe dumped years ago. Maybe someone tried to seal the pool and used the wrong materials. That night, my chest felt tight. My breath came in short, shallow puffs. I lay on the floor near the sliding doors, trying to draw in air. My tongue felt thick. I called for help using the emergency line saved in my phone, and a medical dispatch team for the nearest town came within the hour. They took me to a clinic. I couldn't speak properly by then. My throat had closed up. My skin was covered in a red, blistered rash from my neck down to my legs. At the clinic, they ran blood tests, took skin samples, and kept me on oxygen for 2 days. They asked about chemical exposure, and I told them about the pool. One nurse went quiet when I described the color and texture of the water. They ordered more tests. Benzene showed up in my blood. They said it was a moderate level exposure, likely prolonged through skin contact. I was transferred to a hospital in the city for monitoring. It was there, they confirmed it. A thin layer of crude oil had been sitting on the surface of that pool, invisible under low light. Supposedly, the black stone bottom masked the difference. The owner of the estate had bought the property from an old petroleum company that used to own the land, though the pool had been added later. No one had tested the water in years. They weren't even sure how the oil got there. Maybe seepage. Maybe someone tried to patch cracks with industrial sealant and never cleaned the surface. I stayed in the hospital for over a week. The rash eventually faded. My skin peeled in places, and I lost a layer of epidermis on both arms. My lungs recovered slowly. I still get tightness sometimes when I breathe deeply. The fatigue lingered for months. When I finally went back to my apartment, I burned every towel, swimsuit, and camera accessory I'd brought to that estate. I couldn't look at the photos I took. They felt poisoned too. A lawyer contacted me months later. I'd submitted a complaint and medical records. The owners denied knowledge of the oil. They settled, quietly. I used the money to pay hospital bills and therapy. I still work in photography. When I first saw the house, I didn't think twice about the pool. It was just there, like a bonus feature I wasn't sure I'd ever use. The listing said private in-ground pool, and the photos showed a clean, blue rectangle behind the house, edged with pale stone tiles and surrounded by an old wooden fence. I was more focused on the kitchen and the quiet neighborhood. I had just gotten out of a long relationship and needed a place to start over alone. The house sat on the edge of town, near a dry patch of woods and a cracked asphalt road no one seemed to use. It was cheap, too cheap for what it offered. A fully furnished 2-bedroom with new appliances, a garage, a backyard, and that pool. The landlord barely asked any questions. He sent me the lease electronically, and after a few signatures and a deposit, I had the keys. I moved in during a heat wave. The kind of heat that buzzes in your ears, that makes everything stick to your skin. My first night there, I barely slept. The window units rattled and groaned, and even with them blasting, the air felt heavy. I walked barefoot through the house at 3 a.m., my skin damp and my shirt clinging to my back. That was the first time I went out to the backyard. The pool looked strange at night. The moonlight bounced off the water in a dull way, like it was thick instead of clear. I dipped my foot in, expecting warmth after a day of 98 degrees. But it was ice cold, not just refreshing cold. My foot went numb within seconds, like I'd plunged it into a cooler full of frozen water bottles. I yanked it out fast and stood there, dripping confused. I figured the water was deep and hadn't had time to warm up. That made sense at the time. I went back inside and didn't think much about it until the next morning. The sun was blazing by 10 a.m., and I felt gross from unpacking boxes. I thought maybe a swim would help. I hadn't been in a pool in years, not since I was a kid, and I'd always been a little nervous around water. But I was trying to be someone new, someone bolder. I put on an old swimsuit and stepped out onto the baking tiles. The pool looked calm and perfect. The surface didn't ripple, even when I walked right up to the edge. I sat down and dangled my feet in. It was still freezing, even colder than last night, it seemed. I let my legs hang there, trying to get used to it. My skin turned blotchy red, then purple at the edges. It hurt, but I made myself slide in any way. The shock took my breath away. It felt like falling into a lake during a winter hike, like the cold had teeth. I pushed off the wall and floated, trying not to shiver. I didn't last long, maybe 5 minutes. My fingertips were numb, and my lips had gone pale in the mirror when I dried off. But I felt proud of myself for doing it, for facing the fear. That became a pattern. Every day after work, I make myself go for a swim. The water never warmed, not even slightly. The thermometer I bought showed a consistent 41 degrees Fahrenheit, no matter the time of day or weather. It didn't make sense. I started reading about how solar radiation warms pool water, about average ground temperatures, about how long it takes for heat to penetrate still water. But none of it explained this. Still, I kept swimming. Something about it made me feel like I was shedding my old skin. I was someone who tackled things now, who didn't hide from discomfort. I told myself it was good for circulation, that cold plunges were healthy. But then the bruising started. I noticed it one morning while drying off. A patch of purplish skin on the side of my calf, round and soft-edged. I hadn't bumped into anything. A few days later, I had another one on my upper arm. They didn't hurt, but they stayed, and more kept showing up. I stopped swimming for a week. The bruises faded slowly. I told myself it was coincidence, that maybe I had low iron or something. I bought vitamins. I told myself it wasn't the pool. But when I got back in, the skin on my fingers cracked. The tips turned white first, like they were frostbitten. Then they went numb and split open. Just small slits at first, then wider ones that bled when I handled hot water or typed too long. I wore gloves to work. I started wrapping my hands in gauze at night. I stopped seeing people. The inside of the house was fine. The plumbing worked. The taps ran warm. The floorboards didn't creak. But I stopped feeling comfortable there. The air felt damp even with the AC on. My clothes smelled faintly metallic no matter how often I washed them. And I began to notice a chill in the back of the house, near the sliding door that led to the pool. It was always colder there, even on the hottest days. One evening, I crouched beside the pool and skimmed the surface with a meat thermometer. Then I filled a glass with pool water and brought it inside. I tested it in the kitchen with the same thermometer I used for baking. Still 41 degrees. I even boiled the glass to sanitize it, then ran new water from the pool into it and tested it again. Still the same. I drank a sip. It tasted like nothing at first, then something faintly sour like melted plastic or warm coins. I spat it out and dumped the rest. My hand got worse. The bruising spread to my chest and stomach. When I touched my sides, the skin felt loose. Not flabby, just strange. Thinner, less elastic. The tips of 3 fingers turned gray at the edges, and the nails stopped growing. I told myself it was circulation, that the cold water was damaging the blood vessels. But I couldn't stop. It became compulsion. I'd wake up thinking about the water, about floating in it, still and numb. It was like my body wanted it even though it hurt. I couldn't explain it. Then my foot split open. It happened after I got out of the pool one Saturday morning. I had floated for maybe 10 minutes, not moving much, letting the cold take over. I climbed out slowly and stood on the tiles, dripping. As I stepped toward the house, I felt something shift in the arch of my right foot. Then a tear, like a deep paper cut. Blood pooled instantly. I sat down hard and stared. A 2-inch split ran from my heel to the ball of my foot, right along the arch. It wasn't a scrape. It looked like the skin had burst from pressure or brittleness. Like old rubber. I wrapped it tightly and didn't go to the hospital. I didn't want to explain it. I didn't want someone to see the other damage. My hands, my toes, my stomach. I told myself I'd heal on my own. That night, I went down a rabbit hole. I started researching the neighborhood, the house, the land. It wasn't easy. Public records were sparse, and I couldn't find much online. But after several hours, I came across an old PDF in a local planning archive. A blurry, scanned document from the early 80s marked Department of Infrastructure cryogenic line decommission plan. I read it twice before I understood. Back in the 70s, there had been a small experimental facility about a mile from where my house stood. A private company had been testing cryogenic materials, liquid nitrogen transport, vacuum-cooled storage, things like that. For a few years, they'd run a buried pipeline to move coolant from one wing to another. The facility was dismantled in '82. Most of the piping was supposedly removed, but the document noted that some underground line segments remained sealed and buried due to excavation cost. It was a rough map. My street wasn't named. It hadn't existed then, but when I overlaid a current map using the cross streets, I saw the truth. My house sat almost directly above where the old pipeline had run. A note on the last page said, "Leak potential, minimal but possible. Monitor groundwater for long-term chemical presence." I closed the laptop and sat in the dark. The pool had been added to the house sometime in the 90s. The property records showed it as a permit filed in '96. It lined up. They must have dug into the ground and tapped into the area above the old pipeline without knowing. Or maybe the builder had known and didn't care. It wasn't the water itself that was cold. It was what lay beneath. The cryogenic line hadn't been fully removed, and it was still leaking something. Maybe slowly, maybe invisibly, but enough to keep the water above it freezing year-round. I thought of my skin, my blood vessels, my foot, the cracked fingertips. It was the same kind of damage as frostbite. The cold had crept up from underneath. Not a temperature drop from air, but from contact, daily exposure, over and over. I didn't go near the pool again. I drained it using the filter pump and a long hose that led into the woods behind the fence. The water took days to disappear. When the bottom showed, it looked bleached like bone. The concrete was cracked in places I hadn't seen before. I had the soil tested. I sent samples to a private lab I found online. When the results came back, they listed traces of residual industrial coolants, things I couldn't pronounce. Nothing wildly toxic by EPA standards, but the technician's note was clear. Extended exposure not recommended. Ground temperature far below ambient. Possible subsurface chemical leak. I moved out that month. I didn't fight the lease termination. I didn't call the landlord. I didn't report anything. I packed what I could carry and left the rest. Furniture, clothes, the swimsuit. I just left. It took a long time for my body to start healing. The bruises faded first, then the cracks on my fingers. Some damage stayed. My nails never grew back quite. I hadn't been swimming in years when I found the place. It was late summer, and the sun was still harsh in the afternoons. I was in a new town, taking some time off after quitting my job in the city. I rented a small house just outside the main part town, far enough to feel quiet, but close enough to drive in if I needed groceries or coffee. I liked to walk around the area. There were trails nearby and a few old buildings that looked abandoned. Sometimes I'd wander for hours, not really knowing where I was headed. It was peaceful. I didn't talk to many people, and I liked it that way. I first saw the pool when I was walking down an overgrown trail that curved behind a row of trees. The concrete edge of it showed through the weeds, cracked and weathered. I thought it was just a big empty pit at first, but when I got closer, I saw that it was filled. The water wasn't clear. It had a strange, dull blue-green look to it, like paint mixed with mud. Not dirty exactly, just still. No leaves floated on it. No bugs skated across the surface. It looked like glass, like something frozen. It was surrounded by a rusting chain-link fence, but most of it had fallen down. I stepped through a gap and walked to the edge. The pool was deep. It didn't have a shallow end like modern ones. It just dropped straight down. There were metal steps on one side that led into the water, covered in white calcium buildup and rust. No signs, no warnings, no life buoys, no chairs or anything around it. It was like someone had drained the life out of the place and left only the shell behind. It didn't look like a public pool or one meant for families. It had a more serious feel, almost like something used for training. The tiles at the bottom were a faded shade of blue, but I couldn't see much detail. The water didn't let you see more than a few feet in. I didn't go in. Not then. I just stood there, staring at the surface. There was something odd about how still it was. Most outdoor pools get some ripples from the wind or a tree branch falling in. This one was motionless. Not calm, just waiting. I went home and didn't think about it much until the next day. It was hot. The little AC unit in my house wasn't cutting it. I had a cold shower, but it didn't help. I kept thinking about the pool, about how deep it looked, how cool the water must be. I didn't want to go to a public pool. Too many people, too much noise. I grabbed a towel and headed back. When I got there, the water looked the same, still and heavy. I walked around the edge again, looking for anything that might give me a clue about who owned it or used to use it. There was nothing. The concrete had dark stains like oil or old water damage, and the ground was cracked in places. A tree had started growing through one corner of the fence. I stood there for a long time, just looking at the water. Then I sat on the edge and dipped my legs in. It was cold. Not freezing, but it sent a sharp chill up my spine. I waited a few minutes, then slipped in fully. The water was heavier than I expected. Not in weight exactly, but in how it felt against my body. There was a weird resistance to it. I had to push harder to move, but it wasn't sticky, just thick. I thought maybe it had some chemicals in it or the balance was off. I swam to the center and floated on my back. The sun was hot on my face, but my body was cold beneath the surface. It was quiet, almost too quiet. I could hear the blood in my ears, the sound of my own breath and nothing else. Then I went under, just to see how it felt. The water closed over my head, and I opened my eyes. It was dark green-blue, cloudy. I could barely see my hands in front of me. I turned upright and tried to see the bottom. Nothing, just a slow fade into darker water. I pushed off the wall and swam back to the side. As I climbed out, I noticed something strange. My skin had a thin film on it, like residue. It washed off when I toweled off, but it stuck to the towel, left a grayish smear. I didn't feel sick, just cold. I told myself I wouldn't go back. Something about the water felt wrong. But 2 days later, I went again. This time I brought goggles. I slid in again and did a few laps. The water didn't move much, even when I swam. It rippled and settled almost instantly. I put on the goggles and went under, trying to get to the bottom. I kicked down, but felt like I wasn't getting anywhere. I didn't see any floor, just the same fading green. I came up gasping, the weight of the water heavy in my chest. When I reached the edge, I saw something. A shape, small, pale, floating just beneath the surface, maybe 10 feet away. I blinked and it was gone. I thought it was my reflection or maybe a trick of the light. The surface played tricks. I stood still and watched. Nothing. I went home and scrubbed my skin raw in the shower. That night, I had dreams. Not nightmares exactly, just endless floating. Me drifting in thick water, looking down into nothing. But I couldn't wake myself up. I was just there, floating, the pressure of the water squeezing tighter and tighter around me. I didn't sleep the next night, but something pulled me back. A week later, I went again. It was evening. I wanted to see what the pool looked like when the light changed. The surface looked darker, almost oily. The trees cast long shadows across it. I sat at the edge again, just looking in. There were no fish, no bugs, no frogs or birds, no leaves. It was like everything avoided it. Even the wind didn't seem to touch the surface. I didn't go in that time. I just stared. The longer I watched, the more I thought I saw shapes moving deep below, but only for a second. A flicker, a blur. I told myself it was my mind playing games, but I kept going back. Always alone, always without telling anyone. I started to feel changes. Small at first. My skin was dry no matter how much I moisturized. My eyes burned sometimes. My nails went brittle. I felt heavy, like my body was dragging extra weight I couldn't see. I started waking up sore. My shoulders, my chest, my legs. It felt like I'd run miles in my sleep. Then came the nosebleeds. Always after I'd been to the pool. Always thick, slow blood that didn't clot fast. It would run down my throat and make me gag. I didn't tell anyone. What would I say? One day, I stayed in the pool longer than usual. The water didn't feel cold anymore. It felt familiar, like a second skin. I went under, deeper than before. I kicked and pulled myself down as far as I could go. My ears popped. My lungs burned. I still didn't see the bottom, but I felt it. A pressure, a slow, pulsing weight from below. Like something massive was sitting in the depths, waiting. Not alive, not dead, just there. I shot back up and hauled myself out, gasping, trembling. As I lay there on the concrete, I noticed a small wound on my ankle. A scrape, but I hadn't hit anything. The pool had no sharp edges inside. It was like the skin had been rubbed off, raw and pink, like something had touched me. I stayed away after that, for 3 weeks. The dreams didn't stop. My skin didn't heal. My hair started thinning. I felt like my body was drying up from the inside out. I ate more, but lost weight. My gums bled. My heartbeat felt slow. I'd wake in the night, gasping, my chest soaked in sweat. I finally looked up the area. I searched old news reports, construction records, anything. And I found it. The pool was built in the 1960s, part of a research facility that never opened fully to the public. It was used for testing, underwater confinement, hypoxia studies, pressure tolerance trials, mostly with volunteers from the military. The records stopped around 1971. No closure notice. No decommissioning. It just disappeared from the paperwork. I found one old article buried in a scanned newspaper archive. It mentioned a chemical spill. Not massive, not publicized. A line or two about waste disposal and a sudden facility shutdown. No details. No follow-up. I kept digging. Eventually, I found a name, Dr. Elman. He'd worked there in the late 60s. I tracked down his obituary. Died in 1982. Cause of death was respiratory failure and organ damage. He was 42. I looked up the symptoms. They matched mine. I went to a doctor, finally. Told them I'd been swimming in old water. They ran tests. Blood work came back with abnormalities. My kidneys were showing early signs of stress. My red blood cell count was low. I was advised to stop swimming and monitor my diet. I didn't tell them about the dreams, about how I sometimes woke up with wet hair and the taste of chlorine in my mouth, even when I hadn't been near the pool in days. One night, I woke up with water in my ears. My bed was soaked, but the ceiling was dry. There had been no rain. I moved out 2 days later, left the town behind. I didn't go back. I reported the location anonymously, gave the address, wrote down what I found. I never heard anything. Months passed. My symptoms slowly faded, but I never fully recovered. My joints still ache. My skin peels. I have trouble breathing sometimes. The dreams come less often now, but they still come. Always the same. Me drifting down in water that never ends, pressure building around me, lungs tight, eyes stinging, the silence deafening. And something always just below me, not moving, not reaching, just watching.